Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Patricia Carl about EQ, emotional intelligence, and leading with compassion and intentionality. Patricia Carl, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thanks for having me, John. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have the chance to talk with you. You have a really great background and really expertise in an area that will be super beneficial to the listeners. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to share your insights and your wisdom with us. Patricia Carl is president of Highland Performance Solutions. She's an executive coach and consultant, a former chief human resource officer for both public and private equity-backed companies. She partners with leaders, teams, and organizations to drive business outcomes and has worked with clients across industries from companies such as Microsoft, Target Corporation, Deloitte, Citadel, to Silicon Valley startups. She has guest lectured at academic institutions, including the University of Pennsylvania, and her insights have been regularly featured in Forbes, Real Leaders, and other publications. She holds leadership roles with not-for-profit boards and organizations and is an angel investor in multiple technology companies. A super interesting background, and what a pleasure to meet you and to have a chance to talk with you.
Likewise, I'm happy to be here.
Before we launch into our discussion, anything else that you would like to share with the listeners generally about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. As you mentioned, I spent a long career in HR, but what probably doesn't come forward in my bio is that I'm also a trained therapist. And so what's really nice about what I'm able to do now in terms of executive coaching and leadership development is it's this nice intersection of psychology and work and business. And so it's sort of like a full circle moment for me to be able to bring those two elements together and do the work that's really in my sweet spot.
Yeah, that is super interesting. I come from a family of psychologists and therapists. I'm kind of the oddball person that kind of I feel like I do similar things, but I do it in the corporate business realm. But you do both. That's really cool. What a great blending of expertise.
Yeah, and sort of germane to what we're talking about today. When I went into HR after getting my license to practice therapy, I thought, well, gee, I'm not sure if I'll ever use it, and boy, did I use it. I mean, it's just one of those set of skills that's really transferable. And helpful because it's, I'm saying this knowing that this is an HR thing to say, but business is all about the people. And if you are able to connect and relate and support and motivate people, then you've probably won the battle.
Absolutely. I completely agree. So I'm in business. I play the dual, scholar practitioner role. I'm a faculty member and department chair and professor of organizational leadership, but my PhD is actually in sociology. And so I have a bit of that interdisciplinary background, that I feel like does help inform a lot of what I do professionally and academically.
Absolutely, for sure.
Today, I mean, there's a lot of things we could discuss, but one of the things I thought would be really fun to dive into with you is to talk about, can tap into that understanding and how leaders can leverage it to lead more effective and empowering types of organizations.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a mouthful, but do you want to start by sharing with us, for those who are a little bit less familiar with EQ, explaining what that is, and then diving into why it's important for leaders to have emotional intelligence?
Yeah, it's gotten a lot of press maybe in the last 10, 15 years or so. Although I'm consistently surprised at how many people know relatively little about it, because it's so critical. So EQ, which is just stands for emotional quotient. It's sort of it's supposed to be the emotional analog to IQ. Is basically your ability to understand and manage your own emotions, and also to understand those of others. So a really simple way to describe it might be someone that you see who has really excellent people skills, somebody who can read a room, who gets the subtext of conversation, and also is able to sort of use that information to navigate relationships and organizations and conflict, and problem solve and influence. And so folks who have this ability really are the folks who are most successful. IQ is important, obviously. Certain skills that you bring to jobs, all important, but they're sort of table stakes. You need sort of a threshold level of those, but the difference maker is EQ. It's how well you're sort of able to move through the relationship aspects of business.
EQ and emotional intelligence, emotional quotient, understanding the role that that plays in organizations, and how individuals. Great overview of the importance of EQ and emotional intelligence. I completely agree. It's so vital. It's so misunderstood and underunderstood in organizations. And I think as a jargon, I think a lot of leaders know it. Like they know the terms, but they don't really know what it means or why it's important. And or at least they don't buy into it enough to feel like it's something that they're going to put the effort towards, to develop that skill set so that they can more effectively lead their people.
Interesting. It's interesting because I think you're right. A lot of people are sort of familiar. What I do hear with some regularity from leaders who, where it becomes sort of evident in the coaching engagement that this is the area they really need to work on, is I get some version of, well, isn't that kind of touchy feely,
Right.
and
Yep.
and I want to make sure I don't lose my edge.
Right.
That's what works for me. And what you sort of have to reframe that for them and explain that actually EQ is the edge
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
they need.
So, I mean, you've spoken to this a bit already, but particularly in times of tremendous change, and I think now qualifies as one of those times where the whole world is kind of upside down, and so many people are either out of jobs or they're working from home, virtual work, and leading people in that kind of an environment is a bit different. And certainly, regardless of the specific dynamics of the workplace right now, we're just in a situation of tremendous change. We're in a situation of high anxiety. So how can leaders utilize emotional intelligence to better lead during these types of times?
Yeah, I would say it's sort of the must-have toolkit in times of upheaval and significant change, and certainly we're experiencing sort of change on steroids, but I think you would agree that change is really constant in the corporate world. The speed of change has increased dramatically anyway. And so folks who are able to, really develop their EQ are able to better support their teams and help them move through change and transformation in a way that's much more effective than those who perhaps are not as high on the EQ scale. So to give a little bit more detail around that, I think you have one of the big pieces of EQ, probably the cornerstone, is knowing oneself and managing oneself. And so, and that's just critical for leaders. Whether you're going through change or not, it's really critical for you as a leader to show up in a way that is consistent and even to your team. So you don't, I'm sure a lot of people who might be listening have had leaders who tend to be more volatile, who might sort of, ride the roller coaster of emotions. And that can be really disconcerting for a team. It can actually make the upheaval worse for them, because now they're trying to react to what's happening with their leader, as well as deal with whatever they might be experiencing. And so leaders who really can map their own inner emotional landscape and manage that can show up in a way that allows them to be more present for their teams.
Yeah, I love that. Self-awareness, critical self-reflection, I think are such important, critical um, abilities and tools to lead generally, but certainly it's a critical part of emotional intelligence. And I can't truly know and understand others until I truly know and understand myself.
Right.
And it's kind of a reciprocal process, right? The more I know about myself, the more I can learn and know about others. And all of that becomes a foundation of effective and successful, sustainable leadership.
Yeah.
And to your point a minute ago about, the leader who has the edge, they pride themselves on that edge. And I always come back to it's easy to get compliance through my leadership style. It's hard to get commitment through my leadership style.
Right.
And which one is sustainable? That's the question for leaders. And compliance-based leadership is not sustainable. And so even if I feel like my edginess can help to get the immediate results that I want, it's not going to help me create a long-term sustainable organization.
Right. Right. It's a shorter term. It's effective short term, if that's what you're looking for. But you're right. It's not as sustainable. And I think there's something about leaders who are attuned to themselves. It makes them. They usually have a higher degree of humility, and they seem a lot more, I think, accessible to their teams, versus the leader who prides him or herself on having the edge, or who sort of shows up in this with a set of armor all the time. Just having some of that accessibility and vulnerability and humility allows the team to have that themselves, and to be able to say things like, I'm struggling here. This is hard for me. Can you help me try to navigate the situation better?
Yeah.
It gives them, I think, permission.
Yeah, I love that. So what can leaders do if they want to develop higher EQ and have really build that muscle of emotional intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly people who come by it easily. There's, the nature nurture arguments. I think some people are maybe more naturally wired that way, and or have had a set of experiences in their lifetime that have have made them sort of higher on that scale. But having said that, people can develop it, and it just takes intentionality, making sure that I think the best thing to do is to start with understanding, yourself and your own blind spots. What am I good at? What am I not so great at? What are my opportunities? And the way to do that, there are multiple ways to do that, but I think the most effective is to get some kind of 360 feedback, whether that's something formal, like organizations do it internally. I do it as an executive coach. But if that's not an option for someone, they can also do it themselves. Ask friends, their sort of circle of trust, and say, what do you think? What am I good at? What am I not seeing about myself? What are my blind spots? And then the key is to be humble and listen, and don't be defensive, and give them permission to tell you. Because I think that's the piece is none of us see ourselves the way that others see us. So being able to get that kind of input gives us just a better view of ourselves, and gives us, sort of identifies the areas that we might need to work on to get better at being that accessible leader who can be more supportive to our teams.
Yeah, I love so much about that. I love being an accessible leader, being self-aware, being humble, and having that intellectual and leadership humility is so key. Um, Being someone who doesn't feel like we have all the answers, but someone who can actually take that humility, leverage it to ask all the right questions,
Yeah.
and to really be with and to see the person who's sitting right there in front of you, whether it's virtually through Zoom or whether it's actually physically in the room, that you can be with that person, you can be present in that moment, and see and hear and listen, truly listen to them. That's really what it all comes down to. And it is a muscle that has to be built over time for most people. You mentioned it, some people are a little bit more naturally inclined towards it, but it's not something that you have to be born with. You can develop this skill set if you're intentional about it, and if you check yourself and kind of force yourself to have those uncomfortable moments where you look yourself in the mirror and can really see where you stand and what you need to work on.
Right. Yeah, yeah, and once you're able to identify those, I think that I really encourage clients to use their existing strengths to try to build some of that muscle, as you said. So one example of that was I had a client who was in a field that required exactness, very regimented. I think maybe the team would say rigid, and could be very efficient in his dealings with the team. It was sort of all business, and nothing fluffy in his terms, right? Fluffy meaning conversation and any sort of emotional discussion. And so what we did was, studies show, right, it takes about 60 to 90 days to really develop a habit. And so we used his love of structure to schedule time with his team, just sort of we scheduled, this will sound funny, we scheduled informal walk around time. And we mapped out a script in the beginning that was mostly around asking questions, being curious about his team. And in the beginning, I know it felt strange and awkward, and I'm sure it probably came across that way a little bit to his team. Um, but the team's response to that ended up being so rewarding to him that it just kept reinforcing it until it became much more natural. And it was something that he could do in a more, extemporaneous way, versus having to schedule it. And so the team previously had sort of perceived that maybe he didn't care. And the old adage of, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And so being able to demonstrate that to the team, they felt much more engaged and supported. And they could start then, they felt like they had permission to come engage with him and talk about ideas they had or challenges they were encountering. And that just opened up this sort of new dimension to the relationship that was really rewarding, I think, on both sides.
I love that example. Someone that it definitely didn't come naturally to, but they just a matter of being deliberate and, like you said, maybe a little clumsy at first, a little awkward. People aren't quite sure what to make of it, but it doesn't take very long for people want that, they need that, and so as you start to make effort towards that kind of an approach, people will open up and they'll resonate with it.
Yeah, it's I also think there's, this going back to sort of the knowing oneself and managing
Yeah.
oneself. You know, I had an example of a client who, um, you know, for my previous reference, sort of rode the waves, and was very thought he was showing up authentically. So we all hear a lot about authentic leadership, and that doesn't necessarily means putting it all on the table. And he was doing that, and so his team, that caused a lot of stress for his team.
He was an oversharer. Is that what you're saying?
An oversharer. He was an oversharer, and sort of wore all of his emotions on his sleeve. And so in some ways those interactions then sort of became about him and how he was feeling and how he was processing things, which made him less available to his team and to support his team. And so we worked on centering exercises before meetings so that he could sort of show up in a way, verbally and non-verbally. People pay attention to all of your cues, but to show up in a way that was really present for the team. So it's, these are just a couple of examples, but people can develop this. It just takes, again, that intentionality, and then making it a habit until it becomes more natural.
Well, time has flown by. I think we're about out of time, which is unfortunate because this has been a really interesting conversation. And I would love to be able to go deeper into these topics with you at some future date if you're willing and able to come back on.
I'd love that. I could talk about this all day.
As could I. Such an interesting topic, and so timely, so important. Organizational leaders, especially in this time of pandemic and virtual work, I think it's even a greater challenge on finding those connection points and helping people who are socially isolating still feeling connected to the workplace and effectively managing their performance. Requires a heightened level of emotional intelligence at this time.
Yeah, it's more important than ever.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe as we close, could you just take a minute and tell the listeners where they can find you and more about you and get connected with you professionally?
Yeah, sure. Patricia Carl on LinkedIn. My website is highlandperformancesolutions.com. And happy to talk with organizations or individuals about coaching and leadership development.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining us today. I encourage the listeners to go find out more about you and get connected with you. And I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a wonderful week.
You too. Thanks, John. It was such a pleasure.
We are excited about the launch of HCI's new magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine designed to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We will be publishing issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Check out the first issue and let us know what you think. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.